when it comes to the Nittany Lions, you certainly know this team about as well as anyone because of your pod and because all the work you've done over the years. But is this it? Is this the time for Penn State finally where they get over that hump?
It certainly feels like it. A lot of Penn State football fans have been thinking that they should be in the national championship picture for the last 40 years. And it's been about 40 years since Penn State won a national championship all the way back in 1986. I wasn't even a glimmer in my father's eye at that point. So I'm looking forward to seeing how this season goes. It's been so interesting, and a lot of the hopes and aspirations of Penn State fans have been tethered to quarterback Drew Aller. In 2023, when he became the starter, everybody thought, well, we're automatically going to go to the national championship and he can walk on water. And it was ultimately Aller replacing Sean Clifford, and there was excitement around that. That wasn't the case in 2023. It's shocking that a young quarterback had to develop and learn. And he did the same thing last year, got incrementally better. A lot of people are crucifying him for his performance against Notre Dame in the Orange Bowl in the semifinal of the college football playoff. But everything I've heard so far at a training camp is that he has shown that incremental progress that he's shown ever since high school, by the way. He's continued to improve every single year, worked on his body, got a little bit more mobile, a little bit stronger, has developed a good rapport with his new wide receivers, 3 transfer wide receivers. But I think the big positive that people are forgetting about going into this season is that Penn State has arguably the best offensive line and arguably the best running back room in America. That is where Penn State is going to lean in 2025.
I don't think people have that many questions about the talent on the roster. I feel like when it comes to questions, as a national championship contender, people always look at James Franklin. Do you think it's a fair narrative that he can't win the big one?
I think just in terms of track record, yeah. I mean, he hasn't yet, but there's a lot of great coaches who hadn't won the big one until they won the big one. And I think you could have said that years ago about Kirby Smart, for instance, and then he finally got over the hump. So I think people fail to comprehend the job that James Franklin inherited when he walked into Happy Valley in 2014. This team was nearly DOA. And considering all the sanctions that came out of the Sandusky scandal, he talked about it this past weekend. When he got onto campus, he had 4 scholarship offensive linemen. 4. You need 5, by the way. So now he has roughly 22 to 25, 8 to 9 of which he believes could be starters anywhere in America. The depth that he's created has been absolutely incredible. The job that they've done recruiting, not just going for the high dollar value guys or going for the 5 stars, no matter what, we're just going for the stars next to their name. It's going for the right fit, culture, all those sorts of things that are really important for team football. And I think also the infrastructure that he's had to improve at Penn State to make it a top flight program to compete with the big boys in the Big Ten and the SEC. He's had to do all that work behind closed doors. So a lot of Penn State football fans, college football fans nationally, just won't be able to comprehend that unless they step foot inside the Lash building in State College, Pennsylvania. So I think he has a very strong chance to do it this year. On their regular season schedule, it is once again, Chelsa, the 2-game season for Penn State. You're at home against Oregon September 27th, and then you're at Ohio State on November 1st. I'll show respect to Indiana at home for Penn State on November 8th, considering Indiana made the playoff last year. So depending on who you talk to, 2 to 3 really critical games in the regular season that will determine everything for Penn State in 2025.
We're talking with Tom Hannifan from the State of State pod, also play-by-play for TNA Wrestling. Tom, is the most underrated part, or maybe it's not underrated, the one thing that maybe we're not paying enough attention to, the Penn State defense, because this is a top 10 unit that was just nasty last year, and it looks like they're going to be the same this time around.
Yeah, this should be a really good unit. It's just going to look different. I think the last few years you've seen a lot of instances where Penn State's defensive front, defensive linemen, defensive ends have been the stars. Abdul Carter just went, number 3 overall to the New York Giants. So that is going to leave a void. I think a lot of people know about defensive end Denai Dennis Sutton. What he did against Boise State and against Notre Dame last year in the playoff made him a household name. Zane Duran, a defensive tackle, is on Bruce Feldman's freaks list. He's about 5'11", 300 pounds, and he runs a 4.6 40, which is insane. So I think Penn State has some stars along the defensive line, but some depth questions that they're trying to answer here in camp. The real strength of the defense is going to be in the secondary. Depth at safety with Zachy Wheatley, a ton of talented corners, And I think the really intriguing part of this whole thing, I just mentioned Penn State is at Ohio State on November 1st. Well, their new defensive coordinator is Jim Knowles, who was the defensive coordinator for Ohio State when they won a national title last year, had been there for a while, and is largely respected as maybe the best defensive coordinator going right now in college football. So if Jim Knowles can take this defense and mold it quickly, considering this is a team dealing with injuries from last season and learning this install program right now, they're going to have a really good chance. It's just going to look different. I think you're going to see a lot more coverage pressures, a lot more pass breakups than you will see, for instance, sacks. So don't get hung up in the stats necessarily.
Yeah, I think that kind of leads into my next question, because you're right. It is a few big games that will determine the season for Penn State. So looking forward, how do you think they match up against some of these top contenders? Because sometimes it's about matchups. And of course, you look at Texas and you see Arch Manning, and you kind of mentioned some of the guys on the defensive line. Is this a defense that could get after the quarterback enough? And how do you think they match up against Texas, against Oregon, against some of these other contenders?
Texas is such an outlier right now, right? I mean, everybody's projecting, depending on which sports book you look at, Arch Manning's already going to win the Heisman. Well, what did he start? One full game last year against a competent opponent? I mean, he came in the Georgia game and he looked like a deer in headlights. So I'm curious to see what Arch Manning actually looks like as the starter for the Texas Longhorns. Can Penn State hack it with some of these top flight programs? I think from a talent perspective, yes. At least just looking at their schedule, the teams we know that they're going to face. I think the Oregon game sets up really nicely for Penn State. You have 3 non-conference games, and no disrespect to these teams, but it's Nevada, FIU, and Villanova. Those should be virtually preseason games for Penn State. Then they get a bye. Then September 27th at night in a whiteout, they're going to host Dante Moore and the Oregon Ducks. Dante Moore, granted, showed some flash at UCLA as a freshman, sat behind Dylan Gabriel last year, but we really don't know what he's going to be as the full-fledged starter for the Ducks and offensive coordinator Stein there. So I'm curious to see how that plays out. And then also for the Ohio State game, okay, Julian Sayin at quarterback, similar situation with Dante Moore. There's talent, there's a lot of hype. We don't know what it looks like, and he has less experience as a starter. In fact, he has no experience as a starter. Is he the guy? And Jeremiah Smith and company, yes, there's that talent. I think Penn State's secondary is going to be able to provide a decent challenge for Ohio State, and they talked about it this past weekend, not just being so hell-bent on playing man every single time they go out there. James Franklin said it. 2 to 3 opponents a year, you can't just do that. You're going to have to show different looks. And I think that's the thing about Jim Knowles is he's prepared to put multiple looks out there, and he has a lot of experience against these Big Ten teams. So I feel optimistic that Penn State can hack it with the best in the country.
Tom, when you look at Ohio State in particular, and I feel like, I mean, I'm a Texas guy, but I feel like Texas is a little overvalued here just based on Arch and the hype surrounding that. But you could maybe say the same about Ohio State because they're the defending national champions, but also they lost 9 players on offense. They're working in Julian Sayin. From your perspective, is there a possibility that the Buckeyes are maybe getting a little too much credit because they lost so many integral pieces?
I think, yes, 100%. I very much believe in I'll believe it when I see it. So for people to be projecting ahead of, oh, they're absolutely going to win the Big Ten championship or they're going to compete for the national championship, we don't know what this team is going to look like. To your point, the pieces that went off to the National Football League on offense and defense, some guys that were really critical locker room leaders like Jack Sawyer. Now you still have a fantastic safety there in Caleb Downs, a lot of really talented pieces along the defensive line and at linebacker. So I think Ohio State is Ohio State at the end of the day. They're deep. They have a lot of talent. They're going to be able to put some interesting pieces out there. I think the real question mark going into this season for them is replacing both of their coordinators. And Brian Hartline stepping up from wide receivers coach, maybe the best wide receivers coach in the country, to full-fledged offensive coordinator after Chip Kelly was in and out. That's going to be a real question mark. Now, granted, you have a big red easy button in number 4 with Jeremiah Smith, and a lot of other talented wide receivers, tight ends, all those sorts of things. What does the running game look like? Is Julian Sayin going to pick up where Will Howard and so many other great Buckeye quarterbacks have left off? Or is there a learning curve? Does he develop in October and November? Does he really round into form? What is he like? We talked about James Franklin and Drew Auer in the big games. What does a true first-time starter look like in the big-time games in arguably the biggest program in college football. So I think there's reason for optimism and positivity for Ohio State, justifiably so, but we'll believe it when we see it.
So we've talked a lot about the positives of Penn State. Let's flip it on its ear. What are the sabotage factors? What is stopping Penn State from winning a national championship this year?
I think long-term health is always an issue now that the college football playoff has been expanded to 12 teams, because Penn State played its longest season ever this past year, going all the way into the semifinals. So they've had a number of key players that were banged up from last season, were limited in winter workouts, limited in spring training, and are just kind of getting into the mix here now with fall camp getting underway. And some of those guys are still recovering. I mentioned the 3 non-conference games that are going to be really useful for Penn State. My concerns are going to be, number one, wide receiver. 3 transfer wide receivers, Kyron Hudson from USC, Devontae Ross from Troy, and then Trevor Pena from Syracuse. There's a lot of excitement about. But again, we don't know if that's going to work out. We sincerely hope it will, and they have previous production, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to project and work out at Penn State. Hopefully it does. I am interested to see the depth at defensive end opposite Denida and Sutton. As I mentioned, Abdul Carter, a monster at defensive end, is off to the National Football League. The next starter opposite DDS is expected to be Zariah Fisher, who has been with the program for now 6 years and has dealt with a ton of injuries. So it's just a question of, can he stay healthy and can he produce? Behind defensive tackle Zane Durant, a lot of question marks. Alonzo Ford, banged up for most of the offseason, most of 2024, transferred from Old Dominion a few years ago. He's number 2 behind Zane Durant, and he's just kind of getting into the flow here with Jim Knowles and this install for the defense at this point in time in August. What's the depth behind those guys? Linebacker, it's a 4-2-5 defense, and you have a transfer in Amari Campbell from UNC. Okay, how does that work out? So there's just a lot of question marks in terms of depth pieces. And again, if you're playing into December and January, like Penn State expects to be, you need to feel really confident in your depth pieces.